cold, wintry November evening, and I was just settling in to watch a film, and then suddenly I had a flood of thoughts come through about multiculturalism, and I thought I need to go and get this stuff sorted out. I need to make a video, so I jumped in my car and started to drive over. And as I drove over, I switched the radio on, and this beautiful music started up. Ravel's Bolero. And obviously this had an effect on my thinking. Well, it would, wouldn't it? But what was so much more important to me, as I sit here in the pitch black, is the feeling it gave me. And why I love music so much. And how you can get annoyed and niggled, and you can have all these thoughts and battles in your head and doubts and all sorts of different things. But when I switched this on and it started up, suddenly the world's a beautiful place. And so on the video you're about to see, when I talk about multiculturalism, please bear that in mind. And when you see me next, I'll be up in my studio talking about whether multiculturalism is a good thing or not. Okay, I'm in my studio now, about to do a little talk on multiculturalism. And now I'm sat in here in the dark. It's quite creepy. And I've just done another video to warm up, and I'm sure I saw some sort of ghostly presence in the background. And now I've got that thing of wanting to look over my shoulder all the time. I don't know why, because I can look into my camera now, I can see what's over my shoulder. Oh, it's quite frightening, isn't it? Because, I'll tell you something, I'll tell you why it's frightening. Because I am sat at the moment in a very old factory. Many, many people have toiled away here, people that are no longer with us. I'm on a special place which is full of history and full of all sorts of different memories, all sorts of different things have gone on here. And so when you walk into a place like this, it evokes a feeling. It evokes a feeling of the past that you're in. But of course, me being a British person, I am a part of that past. That is my culture. This is the culture that I'm in. Now, I'm not actually from this town. My parents moved here in the 1960s. So I don't have quite the connection to this place that other people have. So some of the people who actually live in this town may well have had a boss, because this room here was the boss's office, I think. This big room was where the boss had their office. And so people from my town would have looked up to this person. They would have sat there with all their thoughts going on. All sorts of drama would be happening. Right? Now, this type of history, our own personal history, the fact that I'm not from this town, that's my personal history. And your personal history has an effect on all sorts of different things. So when you're looking at the causes or things, or why people make certain decisions, why are people prejudiced, more prejudiced than others, some of it will be down to their personal history. But also, a lot comes from your culture. And culture is a word which actually does not cover things precisely whatsoever. So you could have the culture of, you know, carpet manufacturers that used to work here. That's a culture. The culture that exists in my town, the culture of being a British person, all these different things are actually vague ideas that don't mean much at all. And then on top of that, because I have a personal history, trying to fit me into that cultural history doesn't work either. And I believe that prejudice, racism, and all this type of stuff is fundamentally based upon the idea that when you look at somebody and you place them into a group, and then you make assumptions about them based upon that group. Now, the reason it's wrong is not because it's evil. The reason it's wrong is because those assumptions will never be true. You cannot make an assumption about an individual based upon the group, and it's very difficult to make assumptions about groups because those groups do not actually exist, and they're vague and they swap around, you know. And once you start to carve up people into groups, you will eventually go, right, so British people, well, what about people that live in the West Midlands like I do? All right, then West Midlands people. What about people that are from West Midlands that are above 40? Okay, and male people above 40. Okay, and musicians that are male and above 40. Oh, yeah, okay. And before you know it, that little patch of ice that you've carved out, that you stood on, which is all wobbly because it's so vague, is getting smaller and smaller as it melts until it's just left with you. Right, so culture is a pretty vague, spongy idea in itself, okay? Of course, there's another much bigger influence on who I am and how I think and what I do, and that is my genes. That is what I've inherited, my biology, right? I think that it's pretty obvious that your biology plays a much bigger part in that. Now, your individual biology is unique to you, but the idea that there's some wide-ranging cultural biology that comes from culture, that you're descended from this race of people and this race of people are like that, there lies all the roots of all the sort of right-wing fascism, nasty stuff, that sort of ethno-culturalism, standing up and saying, I'm a part of this cultural group, I'm a part of this nation, I'm a part of this race, and this race has characteristics. Now, once you get to that point and you start to list those characteristics and build a sort of, you know, esoteric, you know, occult, almost like an occult idea around it, you know, you've got to remember that the Nazis, the good old Nazis that terrified us in the 1940s and warned us against all these things, started off as a branch of the Theosophic Society. Yes, Madame Blavatsky, her with her little letters raining down from the Grand Masters, you know, coming down, that she actually used to get her maid to prod down. There lies the source and root of untold genocides in the 20th century. And it's because the Germans, lacking an identity, because that country was formed, I think, in 1871 when Germany was formed. Because that country was formed at that point, artists went looking for a sort of national identity. And Wagner's idea of sort of reconstituting old German myths into the sort of ring cycle created this idea of the German people. And this sort of ethno-nationalism eventually, through the occult group that the Nazis were, it eventually evolved to the point where you had Adolf Hitler and all that sort of stuff going on. What's interesting is here in the UK, at the same time, a very similar thing happened a little bit later, obviously, so it wasn't the same time. But J.R.R. Tolkien did exactly the same. He looking at the English people that, again, were a collection, much older collection, but a collection of, you know, Danes and the French and Romans and then all sundry immigrants. And to try and collect those together, Tolkien tried to create his own mythos with Lord of the Rings. But for some reason, I think him placing the hobbits as being the master race, which is so not the master race, that embodiment of the English aesthetic in the hobbits, these little people that just want to have a drink and smoke and have a laugh and eat and live in them thing, and they don't want to go and invade Europe. I think the fact that he put that in there was a very, very clever ruse. I mean, if you examine Lord of the Rings and start looking for sort of metaphorical meanings, it does get a little bit worrying, you know, because he does personify other races of people in those. He's definitely got a class system going on. There's definitely a class system going on. And I always thought that he admitted he had based the dwarves on the Jews, for example. So this stuff I don't like. I think the whole success of Western liberal democracy is the liberal bit, which is where you treat everyone as an individual and you say individuals can think and do what they want, unless it's affecting someone else thinking and doing what they want. And as soon as that happens, you can't do that. That is a simple thing to live by, isn't it? All right. So there's an idea that multiculturalism is a good thing. So multiculturalism, you know, by having all these different things together, all these different people, all these different cultures together, they'll all mash together and the greater good will come out of it, okay? Now, my point is that as soon as we start to think that, as soon as we start to think that that is a good thing, that mixing cultures together is a good thing, we miss the point, because I don't think those cultures are strong enough as categories to stand up on their own. Which cultures, what people, what, you know, what? You see? And so we get into this thing where culture becomes a thing in itself. That is the whole problem. Now, were the Nazis, were they a culture? Were the Stalinists, were they a culture? Was Pol Pot, you know, are they a culture? You know, what about underground people who like doing dodgy things like, say crime, organised crime? Is that a culture? Of course it is. Organised crime has a culture. We know it inside out from gangster films, you know, mafia films, The Godfather. There's a culture there. There's their own set of ideals. There's their own set of values. Those values are weighed against one against another. There is its own moral code going on within the culture of the mafia, all right? And so we have to ask our question, can one culture be better than another culture? Is cultural relativism a good thing? Is the mafia the same as, say, the Western liberal democracies, or, say, black American culture? Which one is better and which one's worse? Now, of course, as soon as I go into this area, people will be shouting. And my opinion is that it's a nonsense to say that. To get into that discussion is wrong. And it's just only going to end up, I was going to say in tears, but it's going to end up in the gulag in the end. That is what will happen once you go down that route. The idea that some cultures are all the same makes it worse, because now we have no sense of value and we have no moral code to work to say this is a bad culture. You know, these things here, this is a bad culture. Right, I'm not saying anything about any specific cultures. I'm making the point here that you have to decide philosophically and ethically whether you think a culture are all the same, and that's called cultural relativism. They're all the same. Right, so say if you're looking at an example of virtue like truth, you know, about speaking the truth. Do you believe that, you know, sort of aboriginal, the aboriginal view of the world is exactly the same in terms of establishing truth as science, the culture of science? And so, for example, we get to these moral issues, and this is a real moral issue that's happened. If you have a culture that in there has a certain attitude to women that we don't have here in our Western liberal culture, and so we have a scientist studying artifacts from another culture to try and understand that, then that culture turns around and says women should not touch those because women are lower and they're not allowed to touch those cultural artifacts. And then we turn around and we go, yeah, but in our culture, women are lower and they can touch these artifacts. And they turn around and say, yes, but you've got to follow cultural relativism. And that culture is using that against the culture, which is arguing for values, which I hope most people on this video that were watching this video will go, yeah, well, women are, equal to men. They should be allowed to touch anything exactly the same as men. That division shouldn't come on. So anybody shouting for cultural relativism, that's shouting for multiculturalism, it's not as simple as that. It's not as simple as that. Now, if there's been certain sociological tests where they've put groups of people in together, certain people act in I won't say in a better moral way, because I know the postmodernists and moral relativists won't like it, so I know they're getting angry as it is. But say someone who works in a more conscientious and productive way here, with someone who's less conscientious and less productive here, right? If you start to mingle them culturally together, that does not happen. In fact, that happens, and people will drop down to the sort of lowest common denominator. Since I was a little kid, people with common sense have used the term the lowest common denominator, and there's a reason for that. So as soon as we get into mixing cultures, we've got some problems going on. So, you are shouting at me going, Andy, you have got a music YouTube here. I don't come here for all these sort of political conversations where you get into areas I don't want to consider. You're just stirring the pot of controversy. And you shouldn't be, because you love jazz and soul and blues and funk. And all those are the product of multiculturalism. They are. They are indeed. Okay? Now, we have another issue here. Every artistic thing in the 20th century, whether it, all the great new forms of art, whether it be jazz, blues, soul, gospel, or Hollywood film, or the radio, or vaudeville, every single thing, you know, the theatre, you know, the sort of theatre in New York, whatever you want to call it, you know, all that, every single artistic form that emerged in the 20th century is the product of multiculturalism. The new things that emerged are profound and have a great utility because the best has been teased out of these different cultures. And this is the argument for multiculturalism, is that when you've got lots of art, people working together, you get the best of it. You pull from that and that, and you get this. It's strong. You're stronger. You're stronger. You know, it's like if you look at sort of these ethno-nationalists or these right-wing, you know, sort of feudal kingdoms where they believe their bloodline was so important that in the end they started to marry each other in such a narrow and narrower, you know, range that in the end they all died because they were feeble and got haemophilia and all these types of things because they were all sort of interbreeding. And that interbreeding will always be the, you know, produce terrible things. You don't want to be interbreeding, and that's true culturally, and I think that's the case. The best things, the things I love, are not authentic. I do not value authenticity as a thing. I value interesting, novel, new things that have just the right vavoom culturally to change culture. Cultures should change, and they do change. And the way they change is actually morally and ethically comes from the artist. All the scientists do is tell you about truth. All the technologists can do is take that scientific truth and make stuff that does things. But in terms of our cultural vision of who we are, in terms of what we, the way that our cultures move forward and the way ideas change and values change, and for the better. And here in the West, in the liberal West in the 20th century, is the things that are in Hollywood films and in literature and in jazz and in blues, and all those things worked. They work within the system. And in the 1960s, there's this explosion. And my channel exists here because of that explosion that happens in the 1960s. 60 years later, we are still reeling from the brilliance of it. No, this hasn't just gone away and turned into Rudy Valley or Ivor Novello or artists that we just have no, you know, that have no relevance to us. The stuff that happened in the 1960s within the popular music world, right, was as equal to Bach or Mozart. He stood the test of time. You know, we could put a Jimi Hendrix album on, or a Beatles album, or a Love Supreme, or Miles Davis, you know, or even Steve Reich, or whoever it is you want to listen to from the 60s, and it still gets to you, right? That explosion of different ideas and views coincided within a movement that happened in Western liberal democracy that enabled us to break down all these cultural prejudices and actually try and create a society that where equality and human rights were put at the utmost, right? That is incredibly important. And I feel at the moment, this is being eroded, and ironically, it's been eroded by a sort of cultural relativist, sort of almost like religious belief in cultural categories as being a definitive means of judging human beings. Right, we are back. We're back, everybody. We're back. You know, we're at that point again. Right, and you look out and you see these wars that are going on. What's going on what's going on in, you know, with Israel and Palestine? Categories, cultures, banging up against each other, right? Because they believe those cultures should be pure, because they believe those cultures shouldn't be sullied by other cultures, and they don't want to mix it, and they believe they're absolutely right. And, you know, truth and logic and reason, they don't matter anymore. What matters is what you believe and what you stand for. It's about you identifying in you your personal truth and acting upon it. Now, when I'm saying this, I am mixing horrendous things which are over on the sort of ethno-nationalist realm of things, whether it's Israel or Gaza, the Hamas, all that, or Iran, or whatever it is. I'm equating it with stuff that is definitely happening over on the left wing in identity politics. And I think we're a little bit artistically hamstrung at the moment. So somebody came on to, it might have been Facebook, because I've just gone and got rid of Facebook because I'm finding it so difficult to deal with all this rubbish all the moment. And I need some purity myself. I can't be sullied with silly opinions. Just shot a video about it. I was being facetious and sarcastic then. When we look at, if we believe that culture's everything, if we believe that then everything is culturally constructed, then the people that exist in that culture are products of that cultural construction. If you say, yeah, but these things don't really exist, do they? The answer will come that, but phenomenologically, people feel, they identify with that culture. So the fact that they self-identify as belonging to that culture is enough for them to base their belonging to that culture. And then, because everything is socially constructed, everything that they are is a social construction. So if you want to change the world, you have to change and challenge that social construction. Now, this is such a balmy idea, and there's no logic to it whatsoever, that the evidence that it doesn't work is around us all at the moment. And with the mainstream's decision, and who knows what it is, we all have our theories as to why they have bought in, why the mainstream media is pushing these sorts of ideas, which they are continually, you start to look at how we can mix cultures together. And I think this is an aesthetic problem. I think this is something that I need to talk about on this channel. And that's why I'm here now. That's why I'm sat here in the dark. I was sat at home and thinking, multiculturalism is the biggest subject at the moment that artists need to deal with. And you're dealing with a dialectic, as always. On the one side here is the idea that cultures are full of worth. It's a tiny bit of this cultural relativism idea, which is a good bit. The culture could be really bad. They could have all sorts of bad ideas in there. But in there is a great idea, and we need to bring it in. It might be just an aesthetic idea. It might be a rhythm or a beat or a way of speaking. It might be certain themes. It may be certain ideas, certain worldviews. These are really valuable things. But how do we let them through? You need a filter on those ideas, right? So this is the limit. This is the dialectic limit. Yes, there's brilliant things in that culture, but you need a filter. Right? Over on the other side, okay, is this idea that I've tried to express, which is the more taboo idea, is the cultures won't get on. When you in a culture and you believe in it, because that belief of belonging is phenomenological, then you will stick to your guns, and that creates war and violence and all this type of stuff. And people will want to, so basically the artist in the middle wants to shake up both of those. That's what we want to do. I might be the worst artist in the world, but I've been one all my life. I started off as a painter, and then I became a musician, and now I'm a YouTuber. I can't do anything else. And so I am just drawn to this point in the middle. And I feel like I'm trying to create a unity between these things. And now I've got a YouTube channel. I'm trying to discuss these things. I'm trying to squeeze them in, Let's do a top 10, greatest left-hand guitar players. You all like that? Come and have a look at this video on multiculturalism. I'm trying to create a unity, but I'm very aware that these taboos exist. Now, as I was saying earlier, just before I came off Facebook, somebody had said, There's no taboos anymore. Artists can't rebel against anything. You know, you can do whatever you want now. And so what can artists do next? There's everything that's been rebelled against. And because what people were rebelling against in the 1960s were like sexual taboos, taboos about what people could see in terms of violence. Those were the taboos, and they were pushed against. You can understand the artists that were doing that were almost like putting their lives at risk in doing that. Those aren't the taboos now. The taboos are all around identity groups and categories and cultures. That's where they lie. That is the taboos, right? And if you look at the mainstream media, it does not react to anything else. I know the people who are for those will be saying, yeah, but the other side do it. That's the natural tit for tat. The other side do it. The other side do it. And no. We know where the taboos are. I know as I'm talking to you where the minefields are at. As I'm talking to you now, I wish I could just talk to you straight, but I'm treading very carefully. I was just about to say, oh no, we can't go there, we can't there. We all know where they are. We're all trying to do it. And the people who are virtuous, you know, we all know how virtuous are because they let you know this all the time. They go, well, that's a good thing, Andy, because it's stopping you from saying anything that's bad. To me, my reaction would be, what is bad? Is it your version of bad? Of course it's my version. You would have to have no decency if you thought these things that I think, you know, shouldn't happen, should happen. You would be an immoral person. And I'm afraid the creative person has to push against that, or that morality atrophies. And when that morality atrophies, it becomes absolute. You could take any morality. It doesn't matter whether it's good or bad. You could say, don't eat chocolate. It's really bad for you. And that's true. Right. But then once you get to that point, you go, well, what's the next thing? Stop people from eating chocolate. What if they do eat chocolate? Well, why don't you just put them in prison? If they incite people to eat chocolate, that would be a terrible thing. Now, you're saying, oh, chocolate's not like inciting violence, blah, blah, blah. I know. I do understand this. But my point is the artist is bound to go there. They're bound to go there. We live in a society that if you want, you could go down to a room and you can sign up to join a club that the government's created, and you will be able to go out and commit murder on their decision, and there will be no comeback whatsoever. You're saying that does not exist in the West. It's called the army. We do condone violence in the West all the time. Morality is not cut and dried. It is negotiated. And when you get it wrong, it's absolutely horrendous. So we arrive at this point where we know there's all this multiculturalism. There's on the one side, we have to accept that that's got all this good in, and we want to get the good juice out of the culturalism. We need all the good culturalism juice. But on the other side here is the fact that if we look around us, these cultures are banging up against each other. And when we look at countries that don't have that sort of thing, it's because there's not so much cultures. And that's quite obvious. You know, you bring people in from different cultures. Go, what's going on over there? That exists. I'm afraid it exists. And as I've established, because cultures are on a sort of hierarchy of values, one culture will always be going to the other. We don't like that. Now, I'm going to give you a really harsh example of that, right? Iran has just dropped the age of consent to 9 years old. Or they're about to do this, unless I've got my facts wrong. And I could get my facts wrong. You know, I'm always open to getting my facts wrong. The reason they've dropped the age of consent to 9 years old is because if you read the Quran, Muhammad, who basically is the guy behind it all, well, I think he was dictated to by God, had a wife called Aisha, who he married when she was 6 years old, and they consummated the marriage when they were 9 years old. Now, from my point of view, my cultural living in Kidderminster, growing up in these old, you know, sitting in my old factory with the ghosts walking around behind me, you know, and all that history, my history sort of goes, that's not a good thing. It's not very good. I don't think we can have that here. You see, this is not the worst thing to say. We don't have that here. And this whole thing about the Western liberal democracy, who invented the idea of tolerance, that as I said, through the arts and music and all the cultural stuff that was going on through the 17th, 18th and 19th century, ended up in the 1960s with this bloody incredible thing happening, right? Where we went, look, we've really got to get rid of this. And the fact is racism and prejudice and homophobia and all that, which we have literally, in the last 60 years, notched it down. It's not perfect, but we have notched it down massively. And I promise you, what's notched that down is the idea of tolerance. And if you believe in tolerance, then you will want to tolerate all these cultures, except there's a philosophical dilemma involved in all this. If you believe that tolerance is our absolute value, right, that is an intolerant value. In other words, if you believe that tolerance is like a Kantian virtue, in other words, it's a categorical imperative, and I think it's the only one that there should be, right? The only categorical moral, the only one you can unquestioned, is the idea that we tolerate things. Doesn't mean we like them, but we tolerate them. And we tolerate them on the liberal principle that I brought in right at the beginning of this video, is that you can do whatever you want to do as long as it doesn't impinge on other people and what they want to do or break the law. And we have a set of laws that's evolved, and I don't want to get into about that, but laws have to change as well. But we're talking about cultural values. We're not talking about that sort of criminal law type of thing. Although we have ventured into it, I know this is a very difficult thing to try and get around. And I admit that, and it's not cut and dried. Anyway, let's try and get back onto where I'm going with this, because I'm nearly there with it. If you believe that tolerance is a really important value, which means you're not going to be racist, you're not going to be prejudiced, you're trying to have equality between everybody, not equity, equality. You know, we don't want everyone to be equal. We want a world of difference. That's the whole point in multiculturalism. We want good-looking people, ugly people, thick people, clever people, tall people, short people, musical people, tone-deaf people. We want the whole world. It's all wonderful, and we're going to put our arms around it. And all the ones who have more of this sort of biological privilege, which there is, sorry, we will have a system that looks after the ones who have less privilege, whether it's cultural, whether it's their personal circumstances, or whether it's biological. We will put our arms around the world, and that will be based upon the idea of tolerance. Tolerance is the value that I think we need to live by, and it's the value which should be the overarching value that sits across all these different cultures and lines them up. Now, this idea of tolerance, this idea of democracy, this idea of freedom of expression, this idea of freedom of speech, these are all the really important values. These are the golden values that created the best place to live in the world, in the whole of human history, right? Argue with that if you want to be a cultural relativist, but I know where I want to live, right? So with that, with this idea that these things are of value, and where they're rooted in Western liberal philosophy. And me sat in this room now, right? And let's illuminate the room, shall we? Let's at this point illuminate the room. I'm going to walk off into the darkness and illuminate this room. We'll shine a light on my incredible room, right? This room that is reeked with history, reeked with the product of the Enlightenment, the product of then liberal Western sort of liberal philosophy, and then the Industrial Revolution coming out of that. That's the great gift of my country, of Britain, to the world. Right, and I'm sitting in it now. This history is surrounding me. Doesn't look like it because we've got all those modern lights, you know, when you do it like that. I normally light it differently. But that's where I'm sat at the moment. And when our cousins over the pond decided that they didn't want, you know, George III, you know, looking after everything, they decided to have a go at us. Was that when it was? No, it was before then, wasn't it? What was George III, wasn't it? See, I don't even know my own history there. I'm just showing myself up. They haven't got me a good... Anyway, the point is because America was a new country, unlike many other new countries, for example, things like, I don't know, North Korea and South Korea, I don't know, all these countries that decided to adopt a different system, right? Over in America, what they said is that we're going to build a new country We're going to open our arms to the whole world. And when you come in here, we'll have all these different cultures in. But because there's no familial bonding that happens in another country, otherwise the national identity that the Germans were trying to get and this was trying to get, we haven't actually got that. So what we will have is an overarching culture that everybody signs up to when they come in. This is the American way. If you come here and play by our rules of tolerance, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and liberal democracy, you can become the United States of America, unless you're black. And that's the big problem with the United States of America. But eventually they got round to get, yeah, it does apply to everybody. Oh, does it have to? Yeah, it does. Yeah, I'm afraid so. Are you sure? Are you sure the black people are, they're not different? You know, I mean, we put them in this category of black. Can't we just put a whole bunch of values on that show that they should deserve to be slaves? I mean, you know, can't we go and have a look at old Plato and his slave class? Surely they belong to the slave class. No. Western liberal Enlightenment thinking has shown that everybody is equal. And drop a little bit of Christianity in there as well. This is what makes the world go round. The cultures mix in a certain way. Now, America, which was a new country that was signed up to this idea of multiculturalism, which is basically contained by this overarching idea of tolerance, freedom, and you know, democracy. That thing, and you have to sign up to it. And so, if an American can be any culture. Right, that's the incredible thing about America. Now, America is the most powerful country in history. And the reason is because once that was set up, it allowed all the best of all the cultures to come through. Every bit of cultural juice, the good juice, came through that filter of an overarching idea of Western liberal democracy. That's what held it together. Here in the UK, it's slightly different. But again, here in the UK, you don't have to be a certain race or ethnicity or anything to be a British citizen. British people can be absolutely anything. Now, when we say other countries, we start to think of certain stereotypes. And those stereotypes that exist here, and stereotypes need to be fought. I do think that. But they shouldn't be fought along the lines of strict categorical beliefs and the organisation of these strict categories in a hierarchy of privilege that then can only be overturned by taking that hierarchy of privilege and doing that. It's not a good idea, I'm afraid. And I wish on a video that was only half an hour long or so, I could get more into it. But my point is here. We need multiculturalism. We need lots of different cultures. But here in the West, we also have to believe in our culture. We have to be able to champion our history, right? Realising it's a vague idea, but actually out of it, some of the juice that comes out of this cultural history, my cultural history, the British cultural history, and the American cultural history is something so wonderful that it enables these other cultures to come together. Now, where is that embodied artistically? I cannot think of anywhere where it's more embodied than in jazz. Jazz is the embodiment of everything I've gone through on this channel. Jazz, as some of it was invented, you know, for some of it not invented. Some of it was recorded in 1917 and the record started squirting out, 2021, King Oliver, Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong. As those started to go around the world, by the mid-20s, everybody all over the world was playing jazz. Think about it. You know, and people from different cultures and different beliefs that speak different languages. You know, that Tower of Babel that was erected by human beings through their folly was actually torn down by jazz. Jazz is the universal language. It really is. And within jazz, it allows any musician, when four people sit down in a room and start jamming together, they're playing jazz. They're playing jazz, believe me. You know, unless they decide to get there like a string quartet. They go, we'll be a string quartet. Yeah, we'll get that bark out and we'll play that. And they'll do that. Yeah, that's not jazz. But my point is that jazz just enables anybody with the understanding of the language of jazz. And the language of jazz is a metaphor for that overarching liberal Western democracy. And what is in that that's also in jazz? Does jazz have those things? I don't know, because I've arrived here. And I thought, are those three things of tolerance, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and democracy, is that in jazz? How would that equate to jazz? All right. So the first one, tolerance. Tolerance means that you can play whatever you want to play as long as it doesn't upset what I want to play. That's the very essence of jazz, right? You can push it, you can go up there, but we're going to have to play together, right? And that creates the very first rule of improvisation with somebody else, right? Is that you can do whatever you want. You might even stress me out, but when you stop me from doing what I'm doing, you have to stop. And everybody knows that that is the basic virtue of a great musician, right? Freedom of expression. That means you can do what you want. No one's going to come along and say, don't play that. Now, of course, in jazz, as it's become more, you know, this is the thing I kick against. You know, when you play an altered dominant, you really need to play the Lydian flat 7 scale. And what you're doing is just, you've stayed in the same, it's not the right amount of notes. And really that guitar tone you've got is not right. It's more of a heavy metal tone. It's not right for jazz. I mean, jazz needs to be a soft, you know, a semi-acoustic sound, and it has to have that woolly, you know, all these things that have come in. No, freedom of expression. You've got to allow people to express themselves in any way they want to, whether it's the way Louis Armstrong did, whether it's the way Charlie Parker did, or Lester Young did, or Thelonious Monk did, or Ornette Coleman did, or even Jimi Hendrix did, right? All the great jazz musicians of the 20th century. So, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. Speech equates to the language of jazz. There should be a freedom there. That should be able to move, right? When the early jazz musicians, they created the language of jazz. You know, they brought in certain chords, certain sounds, certain rhythms, certain polyrhythms, certain cadences. They had their, you can have your own language. You don't have to come in. You know, if you're a classical musician, that's your language. Bring it in. If you're a blues musician, that's your language. Bring it in. And then finally, what was the last one? Democracy. And what that means is, if you think of the greatest band leader of the 20th century, the guy that defines it, Duke Ellington, we have to ask yourself whether Duke Ellington ran a democracy. Now, when you hear the stories of Duke Ellington, his great genius was not to write amazing tunes and give them to these musicians to play like some autocrat. What he did is he wrote the composition so people could be themselves within it. That is your constitution. That is your democracy. Jazz shows us how, as a society, to move forward into a truly multicultural space where people can express themselves, they could respect their cultural values, but they should never overwhelm the overarching value we have here. So we end at the contentious point of my video. We need to value our culture here in the West, and we have to see that there's aspects about it. For us, for me, might not be for someone who lives out in North Korea. They might know nothing about it, or people living out in communist countries, or whatever it is. When other countries, they won't value it. The Chinese don't value it, right? But here, where we live, that is where I want to live, where I've got freedom of expression. And if you value that, then you have to value the part of our culture and place it above other cultures and fight for it. So I really want on this video to try and get to a point where you could see that people talking along these lines are not right-wing, they're not, you know, Nazis, they're not fascists, that, or they might be, but I'm not. I am arguing for a system and the best way to create unity and tolerance and the ability for people to express themselves, everybody. I hope you liked this video. I needed to get that off my chest. If you did enjoy it, then please put a like on it. Please subscribe if you want to see some more. Please remember, and I will say this now, I am not an ideologue. My opinions change. They could change a good solid argument and I will change my opinion. Some of the stuff I say on these videos could be right and they could be wrong. I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm just speaking. I don't even know what I'm saying. I have an idea and a thought and I come out and express myself. This is not an academic place. You know, I'm not creating an essay. I'm not using any references. I am just talking, which I think is a very powerful thing to do, right? And I am talking always and referring to aesthetics, not truth. My interest is aesthetics. So if there is something that you're upset by, don't be upset. Just think, I don't agree with that, you know. And put your disagreement in with a counter argument. Not like, you're a fool, you're this, you're that, you shouldn't be saying this. If you had any decency, you would not be saying this. You would not think that. Right? Please don't do that. Try and counter the actual arguments. Because I, as an artist, are taking a position which I feel is needed at the moment culturally, right? I'm taking a position, but the answer to unity is always somewhere in the middle. So if you appreciate what I'm trying to do here, you know, subscribe. If you want to see more stuff, you can go to my Patreon. You can become a free member, or you become a paid member, or you could drop some financial capitalist juice into my capitalist PayPal tip jar down below, and that will become my capital. It's your capital, and you'll pass your capital onto my capital. You know what I'll do with my capital? I'll keep it.